So if you have followed the channel for a while, you are probably very familiar with this bike, but this is my 2022 KTM 350 XCF. This has been my do-it-all machine for the last 2 years. I've raced motocross on it, I've raced cross country on it, I've ridden hard enduro. This bike has seen it all. It's got 173 hours on it, none of which have been very easy hours. As a whole, this bike has treated me very well. I've kept up with the maintenance and this thing has been absolutely awesome. This is my third 350 and I love these bikes. But lately, this thing's been acting up a little bit. It's been running very hot and it's developed a bit of a low-end blubber. I feel like I really got to give this thing throttle to get it going. Once it's in that mid to top, it still pulls pretty strong, but the bottom end of this bike used to be significantly more powerful. Now I really have to work that clutch and it seems like it's starving for fuel. My radiator fan on this bike is set to come on at 200 degrees and lately it's been running almost constantly. In fact, I did a ride a couple weeks ago with my buddy Casey who rides a Husky 350. We compared engine temps. Mine was floating at 200 while his was sitting around 160. Now today is Monday, August 19th, and my final cross-country race of the season is this coming weekend in Helena, Montana, so I'd really like to get this thing running crisp for that race. So I obviously need to get this bike back in my garage to start trying to solve this problem, so let's enjoy this trail ride out and I'll show you guys exactly what's going on. Now there's going to be segments where you watch and you think that thing seems like it's running just fine. This bike still rips. But with 173 hours on the machine, I'm pretty in tune with what it used to feel like and what it currently feels like. And especially when you're racing, every little bit counts, so I really want to try and get this thing figured out. Also a quick shout out to Rocky Mountain ATV MC for this fresh MSR gear. This stuff is actually super comfortable. This has been my main riding gear for the season and it's the most affordable riding gear on the market. So I've got a link down below to Rocky Mountain where you can pick up some of this stuff for less than $100 for a set. So let's get after it. Classic Montana. Excuse me, cows. Excuse me. Excuse me, sir. Thank you. Thank you. See, right there. Right there. On the throttle, mid RPMs, and the bike goes blah, 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 blah. You know? Something like that. I've hopped on 3 or 4 other 350s since I've been experiencing this issue. Oh, gotta hit that little downhill. And every single one I'm like, oh my god, that's what this bike used to feel like. You hear that blubber right there? That was a perfect example. Just a slight brief hesitation in the bottom end, like the bike's not getting enough fuel. Smooth on the throttle, that was not let off, just a blah, blah, blah. It wasn't enough to screw me up or anything, but it's not quite right. So I am back in the shop. As you can see, I did a tank off bike wash, so we are ready to dive into this thing. I do realize from watching footage back, especially that first clip, that it's not abundantly obvious just on GoPro what's going on. But in the first clip I showed, it sounds like I just let off the throttle, where that was actually consistent throttle all the way off that roller. I have a list of things to try that I think are most likely to be the culprit of what's going on here. The reason I am led to believe that this is fuel related and not engine related is I checked my valves just a couple weeks ago. They were in spec. The piston in this bike only has about 40 hours on it. I replaced my clutch pack about 70 hours ago. I've since inspected it and everything looks good in there. And most of the symptoms I'm experiencing would indicate a lean condition or lack of fuel. But I've been wrong before, so let's see if my hunches are right. I'm going to start with a leak down test. That will tell me if my engine is running healthy or not, and it will also indicate where any leakage is coming from, whether that is the valves or the piston. Let's see what we've got. So I proceeded with a leak down test using my Motion Pro leak down tester. To do so, I needed to remove the spark plug and then set the bike at top dead center. This generation KTM makes it very easy to find TDC, as they've got this plug on the ignition cover that reveals a bolt where you can turn the motor over with a 14mm socket, and then you remove this bolt on the opposite side of the engine that reveals the crankshaft. You turn the engine over until a notch in the crankshaft is revealed, and you can reinstall that bolt without the thick copper washer to lock the engine at top dead center. Now there is a chance here I'm on the wrong stroke, but if I was, the leak down test would show enormous leakage, at which point I would just cycle the engine one more time. I threaded the leak down tester into the cylinder head and connected it to an air supply. This revealed a leakage of about 4%, which according to the tester shows a healthy engine. By feeling whether air is escaping from the exhaust, airbox, or valve cover vent hose,
you can tell where the leakage is occurring. All of the air was coming out of the valve cover vent hose, which means that is leakage from the piston rings, which I would consider normal from all of my experience working on these bikes. Now, these are all things I've learned over the years, so if there are any trained mechanics watching this who have anything to add here, please leave me a comment down below. The results of the Leakdown test lead me to believe that any issues I'm experiencing are not likely to be piston or valves related, and I almost forgot to note that I did check my valves a couple of weeks ago and they are all in spec. I installed a brand new spark plug, and you can see by the white tip of this old spark plug that a lean condition is likely. Next up, while I still had the bike locked at top dead center, I wanted to install a new cam chain tensioner from Dirt Tricks. The OEM tensioners on these KTMs work off of oil pressure, and often when you fire the bike you can hear a rattle that goes away after a few seconds. That is the tensioner building tension and the chain ceasing to rattle. Well, my bike has had a bit of a pulsing sound lately, as if that OEM tensioner may be struggling to maintain tension. The Dirt Tricks tensioner is spring-loaded and is a completely mechanical system, leaving no room for failure like the OEM tensioner does. It is easiest to do this by pulling the header, and you can indeed get the tensioner out without moving the engine. I saw some reviews of the tensioner on Rocky Mountain where people thought you had to remove the cylinder head to do this since it's such a tight fit, but that is not the case. As you can see, I removed the end cap and pushed the tensioner in to make space to remove the big cap and then the tensioner. Take note here where the O-ring sits on the tensioner outside of the lip. I spoke with Dave at Dirt Tricks and he informed me quite a few people get this wrong. I installed the tensioner, the cap, and then the spring, followed by the small end cap. Now this small end cap strips very easily, so if you do this task yourself, be extra careful here. With that complete, I unlocked the crank by reinstalling that copper washer and was ready to move on to my next task ahead. I wanted to try cleaning the fuel injector as it had been about 75 hours since I'd done it. The injector can be removed by removing these two 8mm bolts on the bottom of the throttle body and then pulling it out. There is one electrical connector to disconnect as well. Take a look at how much dirt is built up there. I wouldn't be surprised if some had managed to work its way in. I pulled the injector itself out of the fuel line, and here is how I cleaned it.
So here's what I did. I just watched Slavin's video on how to clean an injector, and apparently Enduro Engineering makes a little plug and play connector that connects to a battery so that you can do this. I just set one up with alligator clips to a 9V. I've just got a little piece of cardboard there separating the alligator clips so that the positive and negative aren't touching each other. And check this out. So when I connect the positive here, you'll see this thing spews fuel out of the injector and you can hear it activating. You see the fuel spewing onto the workbench right there. So that's how we get it to open. So we're gonna blast air through it while it's open.
Now while most of what I blew out of there was probably fuel, even if there was one little speck of dirt clogging that injector, it could make a difference. I repeated that process a few times after thoroughly scrubbing the components and installed a new inline fuel filter. Next up was the in-tank fuel filter, which I had never done on this bike. I emptied my fuel without spilling a drop and got to work. This is actually a pretty darn easy task that was fairly intimidating the first time I ever did it on an older KTM. You remove the fuel line from the bottom of the tank along with the other nut, remove the pump connector mount from the front of the tank, and then pull the entire fuel pump all the way out. These Eddiker clamps can be a bit tricky to remove from the filter. I ended up tapping the ends open with a flat blade and a hammer as my dags couldn't cut them, and then removed the inline filter. I replaced it with a new one from the OEM kit I bought, and that kit comes with more Eddiker clamps. Maybe bad practice, but I actually crimped them using my dags as it did the job and didn't damage them whatsoever. There's one more fuel screen inside the pump, and I popped this apart by holding the tabs locked in using zip ties. I swapped that screen and then reinstalled everything in reverse order. Now looking at what is built up in this bottom nut here, you can see even if you use good fuel, you are bound to get contaminants in your tank over time, so this really is important to do every once in a while. I got the bike back together and had one more thing I wanted to try, and that was calibrating my TPS or throttle position sensor. Over time, I had fiddled with idle on this bike and didn't know where my baseline was. I bought this TPS connector tool from Slavin's and I learned everything I'm about to talk about in a different YouTube video. That will be linked below if you want to see a much more detailed version of what I'm about to do. This was easiest by pulling my upper motor mount and then the throttle body cover. I connected my TPS tool and by hitting my starter briefly, it turned on the system and showed a voltage of 0.529, which is the voltage we want, but not necessarily the appropriate tuning of the high idle and idle knobs. I turned both all the way out until they no longer affected the reading. Target voltage is 0.4 volts when neither are impacting the reading, and I was showing 0.38. This could be adjusted by turning the sensor plate, but I would have to remove the throttle body for that, and that is a task for another day. I turned the red idle knob back in until the voltage was back to 0.53. Then I turned the yellow high idle knob in until it began to impact the voltage, at which point I stopped. This ended up being about 15 clicks more than it was before this test, so that should be my baseline, and ideally will improve throttle response. Now you can probably hear from my voice, I ended up getting really sick, but managed to survive the race in Helena and finished off the 406XC series, and will of course have a full race video coming soon. That said, did any of this maintenance help? Well, I do believe the throttle response was improved. I experienced no low-end blubbers, no odd characteristics, and no bogging. That said, the bike still runs at a steady 200 degrees when I'm riding it hard, and my fan runs a lot. So now I have to ask you other 350 owners, how hot does your bike run? This bike hasn't let me down, but I wouldn't think it should be running at a consistent 200 degrees. That said, I certainly use my clutch a lot and I wasn't going easy on the thing. Let me know what you guys think and if there's anything else you might consider trying. Regardless, every piece of maintenance I did in this video was well worth it and will keep this bike going for hopefully many hours to come. If nothing else, I hope you learned something, and stay tuned for a full race recap of the Helena race.